So, Judith Curry, welcome to Resilience.tv. You are a climatologist. You are currently president and co-owner of Climate Forecast Applications Network, CFAN, which is a private company active in weather and climate forecast. You also run a blog, it's called Climate, etc., at judithcurry.com. And you were previously professor and chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology for 13 years. You are now a professor emeritus and retired from academia. Am I right so far?
Yes.
Good. 2 years ago, you published a book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. And I'm very happy to say that the French edition just got published, I think a few weeks ago. It has a very catchy title in French, a lot catchier. Maybe it was the editor's choice than the original title. Le changement climatique n'est plus ce qu'il était, which translates to climate change is not what it used to be, aux éditions de l'Artilleur. I have to ask you, because whenever there's any interview about climate change, I need to ask that question. Do you have currently any conflicts of interest?
I don't know what that means in context of climate change. I'm a citizen who lives on this planet. I care about the climate, and I have a company, Climate Forecast Applications and Risk, where a Climate Forecast Applications Network, where I work with clients to help them understand and manage weather and climate-related risks. My clients include governments, everything from governments to petroleum companies to wind farm owners, insurance companies, a whole range. Okay, if any of that relates to a conflict of interest by your definition, I couldn't say. But I think for myself, my independence has been expensive for me in terms of my premature retirement from Georgia Tech and giving up a big salary. And so I say what I think, and I think carefully about what I say.
Good. You know, I have to ask that question because otherwise I will be accused of not having asked that question. It's the way the game works these days. So I'm glad I asked it, and thank you for your answer. You are a vocal critic of the current state of the climate narrative, but that was not always the case. And before we focus on your book, I would like to give you some space to tell the story of how you became a critic of that narrative. And to my understanding, it started in September 2005 when you published a scientific paper on hurricanes. And the date matters because your paper was published literally, if I'm right, a few weeks after Hurricane Katrina. So can you please share this story with us and also its aftermath?
Okay. In 2005, as you said, I co-authored a paper. It was published in the journal Science, and we had analyzed global hurricane statistics. And it was the first time anybody put together a whole global data set. And we found that in the satellite era since 1970, the percent of category 4 and 5 hurricanes had increased substantially. Okay. And so this paper was published 2 weeks after Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. We were not making a big statement about global warming. We said that this was consistent with the temperature increase. Our main message, in the press conference after publication of the paper is that places like New Orleans need to prepare for category 4 and 5 hurricanes, not just category 3. And that was the point we wanted to get across. But this became our paper, and this whole issue of hurricanes and global warming became a big focusing event for the whole global warming issue. Because prior to publication of our paper, people said, 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees warming. I mean, who cares? That kind of change happens from day to day, from season to season, and so on. But the first time they thought, well, if, a degree of warming can cause stronger hurricanes, well, then we have something to worry about. And so that was the significance of the paper. And, the amount of media attention that we got was insane. And I and my co-authors had to decide, how are we going to deal with this global warming issue? And we thought that the responsible thing to do was to support the UN IPCC climate consensus. We thought that was the responsible thing to do. Okay. However, I was uneasy about the way scientists were becoming activists. I was uneasy about the incomplete portrayal of uncertainty by the IPCC. I was concerned about overconfidence in their conclusions, but I went with the adage, don't listen to what one scientist says, listen to what thousands of scientists say, under the auspices of the United Nations. So I bought into that whole story. Now, this all changed November of 2009, and you may remember the so-called Climategate emails. This was the hacking or otherwise unauthorized release of emails from the University of East Anglia Climate Research Unit, and it characterized a number of IPCC authors, both from the University of East Anglia and around the world, and it revealed what I regarded as a bunch of unethical skullduggery to try to sabotage anyone who disagreed with them, rig the peer review process, work around IPCC guidelines, try to silence and marginalize anybody who disagreed with them. Okay, and I thought that was just terrible, embarrassing, and unethical behavior. So I spoke out, and I wrote several essays trying to, the main points of my essays were to say, look, we have to do better. We need to make all our data publicly available. We need to make our methods and models publicly available. We need to be more honest about what we don't know, better characterization of uncertainties, and not be overconfident in our conclusions. And finally, we need to treat people who disagree with us respectfully and work out our disagreements and try to understand them so we can move the science forward. Now, when I made those statements, I thought, that many other scientists would be following behind me and making similar statements, but there was complete silence. Okay, nobody else was speaking out about the kinds of things I was raising, and I became the problem, not the Climategate emails, I became the problem because I was making the important people look bad. I was criticizing the IPCC and important institutions who, and who was I? I wasn't important enough. And so they didn't know how to deal with me. And I continued to keep speaking up. And around this time is when I started my blog, Climate, Etc., to bring out into the open all these uncomfortable topics that nobody wants to talk about. Bring them out in the open. Let's discuss it. And then around 2013, Michael Mann finally figured out what to do with me. Just call her a denier. Okay, label her as a climate denier, discredit her, throw her in the bin with all the loony cranks and the oil companies, and that way we can all ignore her. Okay, and this was very convenient, and journalists and other scientists and people just adopted this uncritically. Even reputable magazine and newspaper outlets in their article would say, well-known climate denier Judith Curry says, it just became, part of my epithet, Judith Curry, climate denier. And so, academia became increasingly uncomfortable, and I became increasingly disgusted with it. And I resigned my position in 2017 and went full-time in the private sector, which I find a much more honest place to be than academia, frankly, because if you do stupid things in the private sector, the company lose money, you lose your job. I mean, you have to be you have to be on the spot. You have to characterize things correctly. You have to be honest about uncertainties, and you can't be overconfident. Otherwise, you're not going to survive in the private sector. So um, I come at this whole issue from a very different perspective than my former colleagues in academia. And my time in the private sector has really given me a deep understanding of risk and risk management and just the overall risk perspective on the climate change problem, which is what I tried to describe in my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, which now has a new title in French. So
Yes.
I'm yeah, so that's the main story.
Thank you for that story. I think it's an important one because you basically what I hear is what I also discovered when I got interested into the science of COVID. The same mechanisms of censorship, trying to evade FOIA requests, all the same dirty tricks which have been used by some scientists to manufacture a consensus during COVID had been used already um, among climate scientists.
Yeah, there are many parallels between climate science and COVID, but um, I think climate scientists invented cancel culture, way back around 2000. And so, the climate scientists are the pros at all this. And then the COVID advocates and alarmists, picked up on all of this right away. And you saw the whole the same situation that you saw in climate that evolved over decades, happened with the COVID thing over a time scale of a couple of years. So it was pretty fascinating for me to watch. And I have several sections in my book drawing parallels with COVID, which I
Yes,
thought a
I,
fascinating example. Yeah.
I read them and I was glad because I had the same feeling, and also the same way to mismanage uncertainty and risk is common to the two themes of COVID and climate. Um, well, let's try to talk about your book. It's a very synthetic book with a lot of references, a lot of information in short chapters. It's very neatly organized, um, but there is a lot of information inside. So I won't do it justice, I'm afraid, but I will try to ask questions which will allow you to shine light over different parts of your book, hopefully. I would like to start with the word consensus because we hear it an awful lot when it comes to climate change. And you criticize what it refers to. So 97% of scientists agree, but you may not agree with that sentence. In your opinion, what do all scientists actually agree about, and what do they disagree about?
Okay. I mean, virtually all scientists agree on a few things. That the Earth's average temperature has been warming for about the last 150 years. Humans have been emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide has an infrared emission spectra, which allows it to keep heat in the atmosphere and the Earth system. Um, and that's what people agree on. The most consequential issues are associated with a great deal of disagreement and uncertainty, such as how much of the recent warming has been caused by humans versus natural variability. How will the climate of the 21st century play out with all the myriad natural climate influences on top of the slow creep of warming? Is warming dangerous? Is warming bad? And will rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels overall benefit humanity or act to its detriment. I mean, those are the most consequential issues, and there's a great deal of uncertainty and disagreement surrounding each of them.
Yes, and it's one of the main messages in your book is that the public discourse on climate has been overly simplified, talking about uncertainty. You explain that it is difficult for scientists to deal with what you call the uncertainty monster. And you also stress that climate change is a wicked problem and that it is a major mistake to treat it as if it was a tame problem. So, what is a tame problem? What is a wicked one? And how does it apply to climate change?
Okay, a tame problem is one where everybody agrees on the problem and agrees on the solution, and there's very little in the way of potential unintended consequences for the solution. Like the example that I give, like red dye number 2 that's used in food, at least in the US. I think Europe is sensible enough to keep these chemicals out of our food supply. If somebody see that this is dangerous to health, and everybody agrees that, well, maybe we should get rid of it, and there would be very minimal consequences. Other than to food manufacturers, they would just have to find a natural food dye. And so that's an example of a tame problem. Okay, a wicked problem is characterized first and foremost by complexity. And I don't mean there's a difference between complicated and complexity. Complicated may have lots of parts, but the causal relationship between all those parts is well understood and straightforward. When you have a complex system, if you tweak one part of it, it can influence other parts in unpredictable ways. Okay. And that's what our climate system can be described as a complex system. A great deal that we don't understand about the climate system. So there's uncertainty. And then there's ambiguity. When you get to solution space, there's ambiguity of values. I mean, in some regions, they think warming isn't a problem or might even be beneficial, where other people are claiming that it's an existential threat. So there's this clear disagreement in values and about the potential dangers of warming. So to me, climate change falls squarely into the class of wicked problems. And wicked problems can't be controlled. They can't be fixed. The best you can do is try to understand it and try to manage the impacts, and maybe try to stop from making the problems worse to the extent that you really believe that emitting fossil fuels is really causing all these problems. But sacrificing our energy system, our agricultural systems on the altar of this hypothesis that, in 50 or 100 years' time, humans may be suffering because of our actions. and this is just a hypothesis. There's a real certainty that the rapid march away from fossil fuels is causing environmental and economic damage, and we're jeopardizing our food supply, our energy supply. And this is just not a good thing for humanity. And we're slowing down the development in Africa because everything has to be, aid money that used to go to help eliminate poverty and support agriculture and reduce vulnerability to extreme weather events is now all tied up in green energy plans, which is really very far down on the list of what the African people want. So, civilization is taking a big step backwards as we try to very quickly transition away from fossil fuels. And ironically, this urgent rush towards net zero is slowing down a more meaningful transition of our 21st century energy systems. I mean, of course, everyone wants more abundant and cleaner and cheaper energy. And there are, new technologies that are coming down the pike and that can be imagined that would help us get there. But wind and solar power are not the answer. You cannot run industrial economies on wind and solar. And they require a huge land footprint, which in Europe, I mean, you have a pretty high population density. You don't have room for all these wind and solar farms. So it's just a bad solution to a very minor problem, in my opinion. So, we need to have, and there's better ways to deal with climate risk, which is what I outline in my book in part 3.
Yes, so since you are talking about solutions, you do focus much more on adaptation on your book than most members of the climate consensus would would do. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what would an adaptation look like, and why would it be a superior option in your view?
Okay, well, humans have always faced weather and climate risks, for tens of thousands of years or however we've been on this planet. And they've slowly figured out how to protect themselves. But our adaptation and our protection against weather and climate risk was vastly accelerated with the Industrial Revolution and with the availability of energy. So we could, build cement and steel and structures that protected us better, and machines and all of this, which helped reduce our vulnerability to weather and climate extremes. In fact, over the last, century, the number of deaths per capita from weather and climate extremes has been reduced by 2 orders of magnitude. So far fewer people lose their lives to the extreme because we've adapted. Okay, what are the targets for adaptation? Well, you want to protect your coastlines, protect it from erosion, keep the natural barriers like mangrove swamps and things like that help minimize the impact of storm surge from winter storms and from hurricanes. You want to manage your water resources so you don't have too much water or too little water. Protect from floods and have reservoirs so you have water during times of drought. A lot of it relates to building codes. Where you build, don't build too close to floodplains. Common sense things like that we've always done. And the point is we have extreme weather events now. We're going to have them in the future. So any investment that we do in resilience or adaptation will help us now and in the future. And there are sensible ways to do this, through both soft adaptation and hard adaptation. Soft adaptation is more emergency management procedures and, planning for events. And hard adaptation relates to infrastructure. This would be your seawalls and things like that, the Thames barrier, all of these kinds of things. And when you're doing hard adaptation, you want to design your infrastructure so it can be built upon if conditions get worse in coming decades or centuries. So you want to, have dynamic adaptation so that your infrastructure doesn't need to be replaced every time things get worse. So you can incrementally add on to what you've built. I mean, the Dutch are masters at all this. I mean, they've engineered every square mile of their environment. Much of the country is 7 feet below sea level. They produce most of the food for Europe, this tiny little country. So, what they've done is quite remarkable. And, we could all learn a lot from the Dutch, but thinking that all our problems are going to go away and we're going to have abundant food and we're going to be safe from extreme weather events if we only stop burning fossil fuels, well, that's just a complete fairy tale.
Yes, indeed. Coming back to the tame versus wicked problem, one of the ways to pretend that it's a tame problem is through models. And I saw the same during COVID. Models were used when no proper data was available. And the use of models in climate science is a necessity because you can't know the future and you have to try to predict it. But it's a very contentious part of climate science. So let's talk about models because you do spend quite a few pages about models in your book. How warm is our planet going to be? And in your opinion, and what does the IPCC actually tell us about what the climate will be in the future? How much do you agree with their analysis? And can we trust the models?
Okay. The IPCC doesn't really make a forecast. What they do is run sensitivity studies of their climate models driven by different amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the different emission scenarios. So they make simple assumptions about what volcanic eruptions and solar radiation variability going to do, which do not necessarily have much to do with reality. They are inadequate at predicting the natural multi-decadal to millennial scale ocean oscillations, which provide a lot of our regional weather and climate variability. And there's a factor of 3 uncertainty in the most fundamental parameter, which is how sensitive is the global climate to a doubling of carbon dioxide. Okay, so with those caveats, I mean, what do those projections from the climate models even mean? Well, next to nothing. We don't know how the climate of the 21st century is going to play out. Um, the most certain part of all this these days is the amount of emissions that we can expect over the 21st century. The extreme emission scenario are now off the table. The UN climate negotiators, the Conference of the Parties, have abandoned the extreme emission scenario since 2021. But the scientists and the IPCC still keeps talking about the extreme emission scenarios. Because if you run the climate models without the extreme emission scenario, you really don't get much of an impact. There's nothing to really worry about. And so, once they start throwing out these extreme emission scenarios, people are going to say, okay, so we're going to see another degree of warming over the course of the 21st century. Well, we already saw that much warming over the last century and we've done just fine. So let's stop worrying about this so much and get on to bigger problems. I mean, that would be the natural reaction once you look at these more modest projections. But there could genuinely be big surprises in the 21st century. Like, for example, in the first half of the 1800s, there were 3 hugely explosive volcanic eruptions, which, the year without the summer and, all sorts of drastic things happened. And there was more than a decade where temperatures really dropped. Could this happen in the 21st century? Of course it could. If it's happened before, it can happen again. Some people are talking about some sort of a solar minimum in the 21st century. Well, could this happen? Well, of course it could. We saw a grand solar maximum in the last half of the 21st century, which certainly spiked the warming. The warming that we observed was not all caused by greenhouse gases. So there's all sorts of things that we don't know. And we have to acknowledge that the future climate is essentially unpredictable. We can put some scenarios out there and try to see, stress test our infrastructure and our systems to these various scenarios, and, see where we might be vulnerable. But at the end of the day, we don't know how the climate of the 21st century will play out. And if you ask a climate scientist, a climate modeler, if you ask them, well, what do you think, I've had, the most alarmist of scientists end up saying, well, they have to agree with me that they don't know how the climate of the 21st century is going to play out. But the human piece could be this and it could be really bad. Well, only if you make completely unrealistic assumptions about emissions, and only if you ignore natural climate variability, both of which to me are rather stupid things to do. I mean, climate
Even
models, I don't want to completely trash climate models. They're useful tools for research. They help us understand how the climate systems work, but they are not prediction machines.
but have the most pessimistic scenarios when it comes to the emissions, haven't they been excluded even by the most diehard alarmists these days?
Okay, well, it's basically the International Energy Agency makes projections, and this is probably the most reliable people out there. And they make projections that are even slightly below the medium emission scenario. And the worst scenarios are there's no storylines that you can tell to get there. Like you have to increase coal burning by 600%. This kind of thing. We know that isn't happening. There's not enough coal reserves, probably to make that happen. At least known coal reserves. Just ridiculous assumptions. You can't come up with a storyline that can make those extreme scenarios happen. They're just implausible, just based on basic things that we know. And then, but more convincing is the International Energy Agency's analysis, where they do the complicated modeling and analyses of everything. And if you look at the track record over the 21st century so far, we're tracking, the basically the moderate emission scenario. So, so those extreme emission scenarios just don't make sense. But the climate scientists are addicted to them because they give the most dramatic results.
And traumatic results get you grants and media attention and fame.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
There is a very contentious issue also about talking about sensitivity, the actual impact of CO2 on the climate. I've seen papers, but I'm not enough of a specialist in climate science to understand them, that suggest that there is a limit to the impact of CO2 on the climate that is much lower than what we thought it would be.
Okay.
What is your opinion about this
Well,
part?
that's a little bit misleading. I mean, the infrared emission spectra of carbon dioxide is well known, and at higher concentrations, certain of these lines get saturated out, and then the lines in the wings of the bands become more important. So you open up new lines in the wings, but even when those get saturated out, what this does is, if it gets saturated near the surface, then the emission level just goes up higher in the atmosphere. And so then it raises. And so the greenhouse effect doesn't go away, and the warming doesn't necessarily go away, but the bands near the surface can become saturated out at high concentrations. So, saying that the greenhouse effect doesn't matter because, the lines have become saturated, it's not the whole story. So that's a real technical detail that I know some scientists raise. But to me, it doesn't falsify the whole thing in any way.
You also stress that another problem with the consensus view, and you talked about it earlier, is the idea of the risk associated to changing climate. That opinion that man-made climate change is dangerous. So, what are the actual dangers, and how much are they exaggerated? I'm talking about extreme events, for instance, which you also talk a lot in your book. You mention them a lot in your book.
Okay, there's two categories of risk here. climate risk. One is what I call let's call it the slow risk of warming. Okay, this would relate to sea level rise, the slow creep of sea level rise, the slow melting glaciers. Okay, those would be in this slow category. And then we have the emergency risk, which relates to, floods and hurricanes and heat waves and droughts and things like that. I mean, that's the emergency risk or the extreme weather events. And even the IPCC finds very little to connect extreme weather and climate events to warming, apart from heat waves. They have medium, as the average temperature increases, you would expect more heat waves, but you would also expect fewer cold waves. And an order of magnitude, people die from cold events than they do from warm events. Okay, so warming should be a net benefit in terms of reducing the loss of lives from heat extremes. And even the IPCC in their latest report acknowledges is that deaths from heat waves are declining as people are getting better warnings and air conditioning and public health and all these other things are substantially reducing the loss of life from heat waves. So, I mean, that's the one unequivocal impact of a warming climate. But the hurricanes, the hails, the flood, droughts, all of these kind of things, there's no empirical evidence that relates all this worsening to a climate. And in fact, with regards to hurricanes, we have good satellite observations over the last 45 years now, since about 1980. And the overall number of hurricanes has declined somewhat. And the number of hurricane days and the intensity, what we call the potential impact of hurricanes, has been declining also. The number of major hurricanes maybe hasn't declined so much, but there's a lot of variability. It's very hard to discern any trends against the natural climate variability, but some of the trends are actually going down, not what you hear in the media. And the issue of, floods and drought, it seems like there have been more floods, but in Europe, I mean, a big, we saw the last summer, especially in Spain, there were horrendous floods. And a part of this is Europe is tearing down its dams. I mean, the dams are largely put there to protect from floods, and they're tearing them down for some sort of environmental considerations. Well, it doesn't help your environment when buildings and ecosystems and everything get destroyed by floods. And then they blame it on, climate change and global warming when it's the real blame belongs on their bad policy in tearing down the dams. In the US, we also had a horrendous flood. I guess it was last summer from Hurricane Helene, which brought a huge amount of rainfall into the Appalachian Mountains, which is sort of near the central Atlantic coast, for those of you who don't have much sense of US geography. And it was horrible. But again, it was a failure, a policy failure. The Tennessee Valley Authority was charged 100 years ago to build dams to prevent these kind of flooding, which is natural in this region. And they built some, but this particular area said, oh no, this is so beautiful, we don't want any more dams. Okay, and sure enough, that's a region that flooded out because they didn't want any dams to spoil their beautiful vistas and whatever. So then they got flooded out. So again, bad policy. We know the solution, but people made different choices, which turned out to be really bad choices. And blaming all of this kind of stuff on global warming, it distracts from our real problems, like not managing our floods to the historical events that we've already had, and we know they're going to happen again. So that's an example. So there's this whole issue of warming, making extreme weather events, it just doesn't hold up to analysis. And even the IPCC acknowledges this. And, it's becoming that the so-called climate skeptics are now the ones quoting the IPCC. It's not, the IPCC reports are no longer sufficiently alarming for the activists. So they just go off, on a different tangent that's simply unsupported, by the scientific analysis. So, and there's some good things. The planet has been greening, okay, for the last 4 decades, substantial greening, from increased carbon dioxide, which is basically plant food, and slightly warmer temperatures and more rainfall. I mean, plants love it. Agriculture, forests, the works. So overall, the planet is greening. What's not to like about that? So, this whole issue is warming dangerous is the weakest part of the argument. I mean, people in the north, Canada, northern China, Russia. I mean, this can only benefit those countries in terms of agriculture and, better climates where people want to live. And, so it's the impacts are spread very unevenly over the globe, and most of the impacts are modulated by the large-scale multi-decadal ocean circulations, which change and shift and whatever. So if you think some location is suffering now, well, odds are in 20, 30 years, the circulations will have flipped and they'll be benefiting. So, nothing is simple here, but the bottom line is it's very difficult to make the case that warming is dangerous. And even with regards to sea level rise, a lot of what, the places where sea level rise is the worst problem, is really mostly associated with the local land sinking. Okay, and a lot of this is from groundwater withdrawal, oil and gas resource extraction, and the sheer weight of buildings. Like Houston, a big city in Texas, which isn't on the coast, but is fairly close to the coast. The whole city has sunk by 20 feet, okay, in the last 70 years. I mean, this isn't sea level rise, this is sinking owing to our land use. So, even the sea level rise issue, you can't, where it's a problem, maybe in many places, less than half of the issue is related to the slow creep of warming. A lot of it's related to our land use. So separating all of this out is not simple, but blaming all of it on fossil-fueled warming is just wrong, and it detracts from the real causes of the problems and from making much better solutions.
I think you might roll your eyes in desperation, and I apologize in advance. But I would like to mention the fear of the so-called tipping points, that the complete collapse of entire ecosystems that could theoretically go as far as rendering Earth inhabitable for humans, like the hothouse Earth, as it's called. And I can see, I can see your reaction already, but it's very commonly mentioned.
Oh yeah. I mean,
I have to address that. Yeah.
okay, if you look at the IPCC reports, okay, and it lists a whole bunch of tipping points, and most of them are fairly minor, like the disappearance of the summer sea ice in the Arctic, but they don't mean full disappearance. They mean 90% disappearance. And in any event, it reforms each winter. So it's not like, so like, okay, what's the problem here? The biggest potential tipping point, or bad thing that could happen to my mind, is the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Okay, again, this is a marine ice sheet. If you took away the ice sheet, the continent would be way below sea level. So it's just an ice sheet that's very unstable and fast moving. That whole area is very dynamic. That ice sheet has waxed and waned during the previous interglacial, which was 120,000 years ago. It's estimated that the West Antarctic ice sheet was smaller than it is now. So it's not like a smaller, it didn't completely collapse. It's not known to have collapsed for many, many hundreds of thousands of years. We've seen much warmer climates in geologic history, and life has thrived in much warmer climates and geologic history. So there's, we're in a relatively warm period, a cool period as far as geologic history goes. So there's no real threat to life. Do ecosystems sometimes collapse? Well, at one time, the Sahara Desert was green. Okay, and it became a desert before we ever started using fossil fuels, and it's parts of it are starting to green again. So these things happen in a natural cycle. Do humans impact ecosystems? For sure, through fires, through converting of land to agriculture and cutting down of forests and the urbanization, all of this kind of stuff. Of course, we impact the surface, which impacts ecosystems, but those impacts, our land use impacts, have far greater impacts on ecosystems than does, slow creep of warming, which is hardly detectable against the substantial natural variations in temperature. So the IPCC does not find anything beyond, nothing on the time scale of the 21st century in terms of where they have anything beyond low confidence in any of these tipping point scenarios. So people cook up these scenarios by using inadequate climate models with extreme emissions forcing, or by looking back into the geologic history and, well, something bad happened then, and it could happen again. So it's very weakly justified, these storylines about tipping points. Could they happen? Potentially, yes. They seem unlikely on the time scale of the 21st century. And if something did happen, like the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, it's more likely due to natural climate variability. There's about 100 volcanoes underneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, a few of them which are active. So melting from below, if that region became more volcanically active, that would much more likely lead to a collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet than would the slow creep of fossil-fueled global warming. So, yeah, I mean, bad things can happen. They've happened before. They can happen again, but they're more likely to be caused by natural climate variability. And most people prefer a warm climate. Okay, in the U.S., we see populations migrating from, northern states like New York and Illinois, and they're going to southern states like Florida and Texas and Arizona. They don't like cold winters. So, people don't like cold winters. And so global warming is taking the edge off of the cold winters. What's not to like?
Talking about risks, I think we have to mention the precautionary principle, because it is something that I also hear very often in my social circle. It goes like this: whatever the uncertainties about the scale and the speed of warming, as well as the extent of the role played by the CO2 emissions, we just can't take the risk of not doing enough just in case. And I think you addressed some of it, because it's a risk benefit balance question basically. But what is your answer to this?
Okay, the precautionary principle works well for tame problems. Okay, with a simple, everyone agrees on the solution, and there's no real downside to the solution. But when you have a wicked problem, applying the precautionary principle can get you into a whole lot of trouble, and you end up with the so-called cure being much worse than the disease. And that's what we're seeing with the climate change problem. I mean, putting the rapid transition away from fossil fuels in Europe, to me, has all but destroyed the economies of several countries in Europe. And the costs of power are very high. They have, blights on their landscape from these wind and solar farms. They're harming ecosystems. So they don't have they don't have enough power. I mean, in the U.S., the power demand is exploding largely from all the data centers and blockchain and artificial intelligence just exploding, and all of these countries, companies associated with that are rapidly building nuclear power plants because they see that's the only thing that's going to be able to supply the power. France is in a relatively good position with your nuclear power plants. Don't shut them down. Keep building them. I mean, you figured out the right solution many decades ago, but some of the other countries are in very big trouble. So this is an example where the cure is worse than the disease. Like I said, thinking that even if we were successful at meeting net zero globally by 2050, we wouldn't notice a change in the weather or climate by 2100. There's big inertia in the system. Sea level rise would, continue to rise. The ice sheets, they have very long time scales in the ice sheets and the oceans. You wouldn't notice it against the background, extreme weather events and whatever. So even if we were successful, we would not notice anything. Maybe by the 22nd or the 23rd century, we would see the sea level rise turn the corner. But, maybe not. Maybe other things would be going on that would completely dwarf whatever we're doing by emitting more or less carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So, we can't control the climate. So we need to acknowledge that. Should we endlessly use the atmosphere as a sewer for pollutants? Well, of course not. But I'm more worried about real pollution like soot and ozone and methane and those kind of things. What you would normally call air and water quality. I'm more worried about that than I am about CO2. If the climate issue hadn't come along, there were sort of natural reasons to transition away from fossil fuels. I mean, they're expensive to extract and to transport. There's all sorts of geopolitical issues. There's pollution issues. So, people would be looking for better solutions over the course of the 21st century. And nuclear certainly is one of those better solutions. So the way I look at it, we're actually slowing down the 21st century energy transition with all this wind and solar farm stuff. They're not going to solve the energy problem. We need more energy, not less. And it's sucking away all the resources, from research and development and from nuclear power. So to my mind, we're actually slowing things down. Since I mentioned wind and solar, I see a problem with the farms. I think rooftop solar is a solution that is viable. It doesn't increase land use. It gives people some autonomy over their power supply. And I think, rooftop solar is a good solution. But again, you're not going to power an industrial economy, with rooftop solar. But I think that is a viable solution. I think the bigger issue is with the solar farms and the wind farms, particularly offshore wind farms, which are very expensive blights on the environment, and they just are not going to power an industrial economy. So, I mean, we just need, like I said, we need to understand the problem. We need to manage the impacts, and we need to develop better technologies so that humans minimize their impact on the environment. I mean, that's the way forward, rather than thinking that we can completely change the global energy system very rapidly and control the climate. I mean, both of those are fairy tales.
Thank you. I think you make it quite clear that the consensus is not real on a scientific level, uh, in your
Okay.
opinion.
Yeah, no,
But,
there's a point to be made that there's a difference
yeah,
between a scientific consensus and a consensus of scientists. Scientific consensus are basically things that are very well understood, and they're so well understood you don't even need to talk about a consensus. Okay. Like the nitrogen atom is heavier than the hydrogen atom. You don't hear about a consensus on that one. A consensus is something that of scientists is something that's negotiated often at the request of a government to, to agree on a position in the face of uncertainty. But people, and that depends on what is the dictate from the politicians and which scientists do you select. But it's and you can get a consensus that way. This is what the IPCC has sought to do, but it's not it it perverts the science when you have great disagreement, and it also can badly mislead policymaking, because if the most fundamental thing about all this is uncertainty, then some sort of a negotiated consensus that's manufactured to meet the desires of certain politicians, um, it's just a very bad recipe for policymaking.
yes, we saw that turbocharged with COVID when
Oh,
the experts were constantly used as a consensus makers on topics such as the capacity of COVID vaccines to prevent transmission. And there was no scientific data, at least
exactly.
after July and August 2021, that would show that, but it was still being trumpeted as an expert consensus on the
I
matter.
know
So,
that was terrible. And then the attacks that were made against very reputable physicians and epidemiologists who said, you were saying, wait a minute, the Great Barrington Declaration and things like that, they were just all but assassinated by the establishment. And in the US, we have an interesting comeuppance. One of the lead authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, Jay Bhattacharya, is President Trump's nominee to head the National Institute of Health. So things are changing in the US, anyways.
yes, I am extremely happy about that, and I hope he will be confirmed.
I know, but he will be. I don't think there's any opposition to that one.
Great. Um, so maybe it's time to talk a little bit about censorship and cancel culture. You did mention your case. You did explain to us why you left academia. Can you give us an idea of how bad it is really for those who, like you yourself, defy the so-called consensus? Because it was awful during COVID, but indeed you were the pioneers in this.
Okay, well, I mean, it really became intolerable, in the sense that, okay, if you in say 2013, after people started calling me a denier, if you would Google Judith Curry, the first page, Judith Curry, climate denier, Judith Curry, serial climate disinformer, Judith Curry attacks scientists, on and on it goes. Okay, so what kind of an image does that give to my employers? The actual tipping point for me in terms of getting ready to resign my position was an op-ed written by Michael Mann, um, about climate deniers. And then it said, Judith Curry, serial climate disinformer. Okay. So Georgia Tech, this is my university, every day they would have Georgia Tech in the news. Okay. And they would cite, where Georgia Tech or Georgia Tech people were mentioned. And right at the top of the list was Judith Curry, serial climate disinformer, Huffington Post. Okay. And this goes out to not just my faculty, I was chair at the time, my faculty and my students, but to my dean and all the other administrators, to all the alumni, and to all the donors at Georgia Tech. And they see this. And I thought, wow, this is really bad for Georgia Tech. So this is, really bad. So then I started saying, okay, like, it's clear that this is when I started plotting my exit strategy from Georgia Tech. I thought, well, first I'm going to try and get a job at another university. I wanted to move to the Western US anyways. So headhunters were after me for some big jobs, like vice provost, chancellor, dean, these kind of things. And I even got a number of interviews. The headhunters thought I was an incredible candidate. But at the end of the day, I got interviews. Nobody hired me, and they said they couldn't hire me because of, if you Google Judith Curry and you see climate disinformer, how can they make this case to the higher administration? So, so I realized that my career in academia was absolutely over. I could, hang around in academia and suck up my big salary for a few more years, be completely marginalized, a tiny office, no teaching assignments, no committee assignments, just completely marginalized. It would take them a few years to actually get rid of me. But I said, no, that's not who I am. So I just quit and, went full time in the private sector. And very few universities can accommodate someone who speaks out. There's maybe one or two in the U.S. Of any reputation, but it's really quite bad. So some of the universities or some of the departments have made people sign an oath. I believe in global warming. We need to urgently do this, that, and the other. And some complete universities have made people, sign these kinds of statements. The tide is turning a little bit with some of the universities, notably University of Chicago, really making a stand for freedom of speech and diversity in faculty perspectives. But, it's going to be a long time before this turns around. Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe in the US under the Trump administration it'll turn around more quickly. It's hard to know. But it's very bad. And I get emails from students who are studying and want to go on for graduate degrees and like what I do and what I say and my perspective on climate change, and they're trying to get advice on where they can go to graduate school, to get a good education and not to be ostracized. Some of these students already have social media presence, Twitter account, with a large following. And some of their tweets, would sort of sound like my tweets, which, had got me blacklisted, back in the pre-Elon Musk days. So there's a few universities that I recommend to them, but most of the people with my perspective have just left university. They've gone to the private sector or to think tanks, non-government organizations, to do their work. Very few people have just bailed from academia who have a more, what I would say, a broader perspective and are open to disagreement and debate and things like that. I mean, disagreement used to be the spice of academic life, no longer. When it comes to a politicized topic like public health or climate change, forget it.
It's extremely disheartening because it really feels like we are turning our backs on the Enlightenment period, and
Exactly.
it's a big deal because it was a big deal when Enlightenment happened, and I think it's a big deal to see it being reversed bit by bit. Yeah.
I know, I agree. I'm hoping France can show some leadership here as really the seat
So
of much of
I'm
what
actually
happened in the Enlightenment.
I'm actually not in France. I live in Switzerland, but I could still agree to your comment about the sources of energy because we are nuclear and hydroelectric. We are pretty safe as well. So maybe a couple last questions. One would be about who can we follow online, or whose books can we read after we read yours? Which are good sources of information among the
Okay.
dissenting voices?
Okay, I have a few books to recommend. One is Unsettled by Steve Koonin. I thought that was very good. Bjorn Lomborg has several books. I think the most relevant is False Alarm. Um, Michael Schellenberger has a book called Apocalypse Never. Um, there's a number of other books out there that I don't think I could exactly remember the titles of the author, so I won't mention them here. But there are a number of good books out there, and they seem to be selling quite well. So there seems to be an audience for books with this different perspective. And
Ah,
on Twitter, there's a number of, oh, gosh, um, there's a number of people, there's a number of good Substacks. I'm on Twitter at CurryJA. If you look at some of my retweets, you'll see some of the people that I follow. They're too numerous to mention here, but there's a lot of good information on Substack, on Twitter, which is now called X.
thank you. Unfortunately, I had already read all of those, all of those books. What are your final thoughts? What are your hopes and wishes for the future of climate science and climate policy?
Okay, well, I think reality is going to get in the way of the current situation. I think we reached peak climate craziness around 2021. I think we're slowly coming back to reality. Um, as I mean, people are abandoning net zero policies. Um, sure, they should try to improve their energy infrastructure, and moving towards nuclear. That's all great, but this urgent rush to wind and solar farms has just been a disaster, in my opinion. In terms of the academic community, I think once the I think we will see a bit of a change in the US because of President Trump, um, in terms of the funding. I mean, the people that he'll put in as agency heads, may have different priorities for funding and frame the announcements of opportunity in different ways, that people don't feel they have to come in full blown alarmist in order to get a grant funded. And I think the editors of the journals, I've seen a little bit of a change recently. Before, they wouldn't even send articles out for review, very credible papers, but if they didn't support the narrative, then they wouldn't even be sent out for review. They seem more willing to review these articles, and I think some of the worst editors have been gotten rid of. So, I think we'll slowly see a change. And I think in the US, it'll be interesting to see how quickly it changes, because um, a lot of the motivation of these alarmist scientists isn't always just their personal politics, it's careerism. They see this as the path to fame and fortune, such as it is for an academic. And so, we could see if the fame and fortune part of this, the drivers, switch, with the change in government, maybe we'll see more honesty and more debate and more diversity of perspectives, which would be very welcome. But, like even Greta Thunberg, okay, has abandoned the climate issue. She thinks it's become, boring. And in a way, the whole alarmist narrative, people aren't as interested in it as they used to be. So hopefully we've seen this change in direction following 2021, and hopefully it will continue. And accelerate, so we can get back to common sense on this issue and good science and sound policy.
Yes, thank you. Let's hope that we will reach that particular tipping point. Indeed. Thanks a lot, Judith Curry. It was a pleasure to listen to you. I'm glad that we could make that interview possible. And if do you have anything that you think I did not ask you about and that should be mentioned?
Oh, I think it was quite a comprehensive interview. I enjoyed talking with you, and I look forward to feedback on my book from the French readership.
Given the title, I'm sure it will be a smash hit. I will just press